move on to the next session. Okay. So this is the 2:30 to 4 o'clock session, Eastern Standard Time. So we are a bit behind by about 15 minutes. So if everyone can kind of keep that in mind as we approach 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I've been told that going a little over is fine, but I thought I'd mention it now. Okay. 3:30 to 5 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Yes, thank you, Amy. Sorry about that. And so we're 15 minutes over that now. Okay, so the next speaker is Samuel Zinaich Jr. And he'll be speaking on the problem of excuses in philosophical counseling. Samuel Zinaich is an associate professor of philosophy in the Department of History and Philosophy at Purdue University Northwest in Hammond, Indiana, which is where I also teach. He is the associate executive director of the NPCA. His research interests are in philosophical counseling, professional ethics, legal theory, and modern philosophy. He is the author of 6 books, and his latest was published in 2020 called Analytical Legal Naturalism, published by Lexington Books. Okay. Sam, whenever you're ready.
I think you're on mute. All right, hi all, Sam Zinaich here. Today I'm going to be talking about the problem of excuses in a consulting context. An often neglected topic in ethics courses is the role that excuses play. In fact, until perhaps the last 10 years or so, I didn't know anything was written about excuses until I came across an article by the late Banks McDaniels. Although introductory textbooks which focus on ethical theory ignore excuses at an ordinary level where ethical decisions are made, excuses appear to be a part of the language game. This is especially true in contexts in which individuals may assume responsibility for their actions. In such contexts, the responsibility individuals may assume depends in part upon the role they play. So when such a situation arises, an individual may be required to tell a story about the role they played. This story, so to speak, amounts to an excuse. For the purpose of this paper, I'll begin by discussing the nature of what an excuse is, how they're employed in an ordinary context. After that, I'll how excuses function within a consultation context and how a philosophical consultant can respond effectively to an excuse employed by a client. Finally, I'll make some brief remarks about the problem of excuses in a consultation context. At a fundamental level, excuses act as a kind of insulation. So at a pre-moral level, where something ethically suspicious may have taken place, an individual P1, for whatever reason, may require an excuse from another individual P2 before P1 makes an ethical judgment about the actions of P2. At this point, we may expect one of 3 excuses, which McDowell lists. The word excuse carries, quote, the word excuse carries different meanings. One meaning suggested by the word alibi is an attempt to avoid responsibility legitimately placed on an actor. Another meaning is a justification, a persuasive reason for being accepted from the otherwise applicable ethical obligation. Excuse may also refer to an explanation as to why the unethical conduct occurred. Such an explanation are useful if one wants to change conduct. These 3 distinctions are enormously helpful, although I intend to focus on the last 2 types of excuses. The notion of alibi, whether used as a noun or a verb, is typically applicable in legal context. Thus, whether we are in an ordinary or professional context, we expect to hear the term alibi where legal accountability becomes a part of the language game. So let's begin the discussion with the role excuses play at an ordinary level. By ordinary level, I intend simply to mean the everyday interaction we expect between people living within a family, interactions among friends, between householders, interacting within the market of goods and services, and so forth. Following Banks, I also make the same sort of distinction between the last two types of excuses. Instead of calling certain excuses persuasive, I use the term normative. Here's what I take on the same distinction. Here's my own take on the same distinction. The major point to make about normative excuses is illustrated by comparing them first to explanatory excuses. An explanatory excuse is a story in which an individual traces the potentially normative status of her action back to one of the 5 excuses discussed by McDowell's article. Such explanations typically start in this way. I'm sorry, but if the explanation begins this way, it may signal a subtle admission of guilt. What follows will be a story of the role an individual believes she played within the pre-moral context, and typically, but not always, she'll attempt to insulate herself to some degree from moral responsibility, guilt, or blame. The explanatory excuses number at least 5. There's a 6th one I'm not going to talk about. 1, claim of ignorance. 2, transfer of responsibility. 3, overriding obligation. 4, irresistible pressure. 5, the fault of the machine. The first 3 of these excuses are obvious. For example, a claim of ignorance is a reason used to indicate that a relevant piece of information which should have been known wasn't known. In fact, the issue isn't that the information was overlooked or even forgotten. On the contrary, the claim of ignorance is simply this: no knowledge whatsoever. The transfer of responsibility is also a reason which individuals use when there is a recognition of a mistake of some sort, but at the same time, an unwillingness to assume all the responsibility. The mistake of the machine is similar to transfer of responsibility. The difference is simply not who else is responsible, but what else is responsible for the breach of conduct, namely a piece of technology. The last 2 excuses are not so obvious, but nevertheless familiar. The overriding obligation is a reason typically associated with conflicts of interest. A conflict of interest occurs when an individual is involved in multiple interests at the same time, one of which could possibly corrupt the motivation for an act on the other. The last excuse revolves around the notion of irresistible pressure. That said, the issue is too complex to discuss. There are many variations. So the following summary may capture what is meant. Individuals often reason that their inappropriate behavior was the result of too many perceived pressures. McDowell adds, quote, "This excuse argues that the element of autonomy or choice was not present," close quote. Normative excuses are similar, but with a crucial difference. Like explanatory excuses, an individual who employs a normative excuse takes up a stance about the role she played in the event. That said, instead of tracing the normative status of her action back to one of the 5 excuses mentioned, she will trace her action back to a moral rule justified by a moral theory or to a moral theory. So with both kinds of excuses in mind, how do excuses work at an ordinary level? Anecdotally speaking, depending on the situation and gravity of the issue, for example, an ethical issue which may have legal repercussions, people tend to overlook breaches in behavior, even if an explanatory excuse is used. In fact, my experience is such that people tend to bend over backwards to let other people off the hook, especially in cases where the individual guilty of a breach attempted an act of kindness or whose heart was in the right place. No doubt familiarity can cover a multitude of sins. Normative excuses are treated differently. On such an occasion, when a normative excuse is employed, no insulation is needed. And ultimately, there is no need to assume any moral responsibility to blame. Moreover, I would insist there's no need to apologize either. Applying excuses to the professions, and in particular within a consultation context, raises interesting issues. For the purpose of this paper and this conference, I have one anecdotal experience to relate. While I was consulting within a local jail in Illinois, I spoke with an individual on several occasions who was convicted of pandering and soliciting child pornography. Even though he was a convicted pedophile, he was considered a trustee at the jail And so he received numerous extra comforts. I met him before he was transferred to a federal prison where he would have to serve 85% of a 12-year term. Only 3 people in the jail knew about his conviction, and I was one of those individuals. Like other inmates at the jail, he requested over the course of several weeks, several 30-minute sessions with me. During our sessions, we discussed many issues, one of which is relevant. The inmate who I'll refer to as T, he's a white male in his middle 20s, was very angry about his conviction and his consequent incarceration. T often vented and complained that he was not guilty and did nothing wrong. Upon hearing such an admission, I took a very specific approach to address T's anger, perhaps one I wouldn't take with everybody. On my view, T's anger was misplaced, and so I sought to refocus his anger in a way that would help him adjust to his incarceration. Although I approached this problem in a specific way, I don't want to imply that this is the right approach. T insisted that he shouldn't be in jail because he didn't do anything wrong. I took issue with T's claim. I agreed that if he didn't do anything wrong, he shouldn't be in jail. However, I asked him, as I did on several occasions, why he was in jail. He told me that he had been set up by an undercover FBI agent in a chat room that he was visiting online. After discussing what exactly happened, T related the following story. T was in the chat room looking for someone who had child porn. For example, he was looking for stories, photographs, and videos. The undercover FBI agent provided artifacts of child pornography and set up a situation by which T could forward the artifacts to other people who might visit the chat room. Eventually, T was arrested, charged with solicitation and pandering of child pornography, and I think accepted a plea deal for a lesser sentence. To all of these facts, T agreed, and yet he still blamed the undercover FBI agent. Once we established the facts of the situation, even though he reluctantly acquiesced, and ultimately T's reasons for incarceration, I tried to refocus his anger. T's unhappiness stemmed from his insistence that he should not be in jail because he didn't do anything wrong or anything illegal. Although he understood why he was arrested and why he was incarcerated, he was still unwilling to assume any responsibility for his action. So I attempted to draw his attention to the choices he made with the hope that he would assume some responsibility for his actions. My suspicion was that T still thought that he fell prey to the evil designs of other people. How could he still blame others for his action at the same time recognize his role in the whole affair? In fact, when I asked T about this, he admitted the same. What emerged was a pattern of reason which employed 2 excuses. I fell prey to the evil designs of other people, or to the devious designs of other people, a version of irresistible pressure. And because I fell prey to the designs of other people, then I should not be blamed for my actions. Therefore, I should not be blamed for my actions. So with the addition of this excuse, the one of transferred responsibility, I asked him a number of questions. My tactic, so to speak, was to bring up the status of T's choices when he decided to enter the chat room and his choices after that. I asked him several questions in a somewhat Socratic fashion. Here's a summary. When someone's choices fall prey to the designs of other people, is the choice voluntary or involuntary? T agreed that in most cases, it seems like it's involuntary. So if it's involuntary, I added, we should probably not blame him, but rather pity him. And he agreed and thought he deserved pity. Next time I asked him how we know when our choices are involuntary. Although T could not really tell me that, I suggested that we could tell if we knew whether our choice was the result of force, some sort of force, or because of ignorance. And here I'm using Aristotle. Well, he thought that sounded reasonable. So following Aristotle, I made this following simple suggestion. At any point in the whole deal, did anyone force you to do anything you didn't want to do? Did anyone force you to ask for or to look at porn pictures? Did anyone force you to give them pictures of child porn when they asked you for pictures? On both accounts, T admitted that no one forced him. So I turned the question of whether his actions were because of ignorance. Although this is a complicated issue, which I didn't really talk much about with T, I simplified the discussion around two questions. First, did you know what you were doing? Two, did you understand the result for what you were doing? Incidentally, I also added two more related questions. Did you understand the fact that child porn is illegal and seriously so? Finally, did you understand you might get caught and get in trouble? To the first two questions, T admitted that he understood what he was doing and what he was trying to get, namely child porn. He also understood that child porn is illegal, but he didn't think that what he received was serious. He didn't think that what he received, the pictures and so forth, was serious enough to get arrested for. Finally, T did not think he would get in trouble or that the FBI would put an undercover agent in a chat room. Unexpectedly during this discussion, T made clear that he thought that the FBI illegally placed or lied about child porn being on his computer because they arrested him at his house. He told me that there wasn't anything on his computer because he deleted everything. T lamented that the FBI told him that they found pictures on his hard drive. Unfortunately, T did not know that copies of everything you download, even if you delete the item, remains on the hard drive. He didn't know that. Even after T and I had this conversation, he was still reluctant to believe that it was false, that he fell prey to the devious designs of the FBI and didn't have a choice. I made clear to T that his actions were voluntary and he did have a choice. That because he had a choice, it follows that he should stop blaming the FBI and blame himself for his poor choices. Finally, I pointed out he deserved to be incarcerated for his actions. Ultimately, I told T that he could attain some sort of happiness if he could learn to take control of his emotions and recognize his role in this ordeal and learn to show respect for himself by assigning the right sort of blame from the wrongness of his action. We'll now turn to the final part of the paper, namely the problems of excuses in a consultation context. The first problem of excuses in a consultation context is that, depending upon the conversations, clients often employ excuses. In the case above, I identified two: irresistible pressure and transference of responsibility. Both excuses were used to bolster my client's position to blame others for his actions instead of looking truthfully at his own involvement in the ordeal. Second, because the discussion of excuses is scant, in some ways, it may be easy for consultants, even philosophical consultants, to overlook the various excuses employed by a client. So familiarity with the various excuses may help focus the client's attention to the logical issues of their predicament. Third, we are left with the problem of how these fit together with LBT. Although more time is needed dedicated to this topic, take T's first complaint. I fell prey to the designs of the devious FBI. I have a choice. This is a version of irresistible pressure. Following Cohen, I want to argue that when an individual makes a statement like this and others like it gives the clients permission to be upset and to be continually upset. In this case, T's claim fits closely to emotional constipation because T is blaming his emotions on an external cause. And finally, T's insistence of blaming the FBI amounts to the damnation of others. This takes place when an individual reasons that when someone else has some sort of serious shortcoming, they're totally worthless, evil, devious, corrupted, and so forth. T blamed and condemned the FBI for the devious behavior and complained that he was set up. To sum up, in this paper, I tried to make a case that the study of excuses and how they're used may benefit the philosophical consultant. My view is that if a client uses an excuse to insulate themselves from moral responsibility, consultants should identify the excuse and bring it to the client's attention. I also argued that such an approach is completely consistent with LBT, and while more research is needed, many, if not all, of the excuses discussed by McDowell may fit under one or more of the categories of LBT, emotional reasoning. So that's my presentation for today.
Thank you very much, Sam. Questions, anyone? That was fairly brief, so we do have a good 12 minutes for questions, and we'll be right on schedule at that point. Questions?
Yeah. Hi, Sam. The question I have is, excuses, can we, as counselors, consultants, differentiate an excuse from, you mentioned normative and explanatory and so forth, but let's say someone is scapegoated. How do we?
I'm sorry. What does scapegoating mean?
Scapegoating?
Yeah.
The way I understand it is that someone is blamed for something that they didn't do.
Okay. Okay.
And if anything, it might be that the person blaming is projecting, their inadequacy or their role on another person. So it's a way for that person who's scapegoating to avoid responsibility and avoid, so by putting it on someone, but it was their fault.
Yeah.
So the scapegoat comes to the consultation and says, I was scapegoated in this situation. How can we actually tease out if the scapegoat is scapegoat or is looking for an excuse, him or herself?
So the question is how to tell the difference, or
Yeah,
that's a great question. Perhaps this is more of a practical response to your question, in the sense that, if you try to establish a relationship of trust with them and tell them that, you're not going to tell anything, but we need to talk, when you need to tell the truth, what exactly did happen. Again, I can assure them that it can trust you. But even if the information, they may tell you the truth. And then we can say, well, really, you didn't deserve the blame, that someone else is transferring the blame on you. But the epistemic question here, there's an epistemic question that, how do we really know? I don't know how to bridge that gap, to be honest with you. But that's really a fascinating question, because, when I'm talking to my students in, for example, professional ethics, and I talk about consultation and things like this, I often tell them that people who come to us for advice are often reluctant on the first time to tell the whole truth, because they are perhaps suspicious. And so that it might be a good policy to have maybe a second conversation where, a week apart. So that gives them sort of a chance to think about that first conversation. And what I've noticed is that in these second consultations, they tend to become if they trust you a little bit more, they're more forthcoming with information. So I tell my students that, they may not be lying exactly, but they might be withholding a bunch of truths, a bunch of important information. And so establishing a bond of trust will contribute to helping them reveal more information.
but even so, now this is hypothetical.
Yeah.
Could it also be that because the truth is elusive here, and it's also maybe he said versus she said or whatever,
Yeah.
right? So this is my version. That maybe on some level also to gain trust would be not necessarily going after the truth, but saying, so in the case that you were scapegoated, let's assume you were scapegoated, how are you going to move beyond beyond that? What are now your voluntary decisions
Yeah.
in terms of how you are going to deal with the scapegoating that went on in, let's say, your household?
Oh,
So
yeah,
instead of trying to discern whether it was really scapegoating or not, taking the victim's role, taking the victim's word for it, and then saying, so how do we move forward with that? Can we do something like that?
oh yeah, and I would, I would probably do both. I would probably tell me their story,
Yeah, right.
and then assuming that it's true, then move on to ask that very next question. Yeah,
Because even with your inmate, it could be like, okay, so you were the victim of the evil designs of the FBI. So how can you find a way, instead of becoming more refined about your porn visits, is there another way that you can escape these evil designs?
well,
I mean, you're humoring him at the same time as you're confronting the person. I'm just wondering.
well, I'm not sure I understand the humor part, but
No, humoring someone,
humoring,
going along with the evil design.
well, okay. So what I did say to him, that if he was a victim, that he shouldn't be in here. But
Okay.
and we talked about what he really did, which he admitted. And so then I followed up with the same sort of response that you, okay, what are we going to do now?
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to do now? Right?
Yeah.
How are you going to change your life? I mean, one of the things that I said to him is that you're not going to gain any sort of happiness unless you face what you did. And that's a very direct approach, which I thought he needed to hear. I don't think anyone was telling him anything like that. His parents were telling him he's not to blame. And so, getting him to at least to face the truth, I thought would be an important step in terms of taking the responsibility and coming to terms with that.
And that also needs trust.
It does. Yeah, it does. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria. We have Antonio next, followed by Amy.
Okie dokie. Hi,
I
Antonio.
put other questions as well, so if you want to, Amy, go first, it's fine.
No, go ahead.
It's just I appreciated really a lot the presentation, and especially, the case, and I was wondering about another thing. Many times people put excuses because sometimes they are, we could say, half aware of the truth, but they're reluctant to admit it, for themselves, or because they may think that admit the truth may shake other fundamental knocks of their existence, we would say, like an unveiling, a sort of Rashomon effect. So if we realize that actually a counsel is holding tight on an excuse because he is reluctant to admit the other consequence, not for his direct responsibility, but for the implication that he may have with other people.
Mm.
How do we approach this kind of cases?
Okay, can you describe the case again?
I just thought about a case, that I came to know. It's like an auntie of mine that she got some problems, with her, she's alone with her son, and her son, got some trouble with justice and other thing, and her son actually is draining her all her income. She got this kind of problem, but she's reluctant to put an excuse or to accept the truth about it because somehow she say, I'm his mother anyway, I need to provide to his needs. And from one side, she knows that what he's doing is wrong, but from the other side, she invents the excuse that, she minimized the thing, it's nothing wrong, and So
Yeah,
in this kind of case, I mean, it's an excuse that she's holding really tight on this because she's reluctant to admit that actually
yeah,
her son is drawing her down.
yeah. It sounds like a symptoms of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, this was the thing. It's like if we got some cases where properly we realize the counselees are holding tight on excuse because they are reluctant to admit other things. How would we approach this kind of thing? So we would go really, really, I mean,
Yeah,
with a pinch of salt.
that's really great. It's a really good example. So on the one hand, she's holding two sort of contrary beliefs, right? On the one hand, she's holding
Exactly.
um, that she knows that she's son is stealing, but she can't come to terms with that. So,
Exactly.
you know, the approach, I've had some similar situations where we had to have very long conversations about both viewpoints, to sort of take the cognitive dissonance, take both of the horns or however, whatever, both sides, and then talk about them, and show the problems with both views. I want to say more about that. I'm trying to think of what else I could say in terms of my approach. You know, in terms of her reluctance, I might start there. Why is she reluctant to believe that her son is doing something improper, right? And then go from there. What kind of reasons would she have? And perhaps there would be some sort of, I'm sure there's some sort of way of looking at it from LBT's emotional reasoning. And I'm just coming up with a blank at this point, sorry.
No, it's I got it complete because I tried to think about this case, I mean, from an emotional reasoning aspect as well. And I
Yeah.
got stuck many points because probably I
Yeah.
wasn't able like to find a way to let the two views, I mean, converge. I just found that they were really split and contradictory. So, I mean, it was a really strange case. That's why I asked.
I'm not
I
sure
mean,
they're contradictory, but I think they might be contrary. They can both be false, but they both can't be true at the same time. I think that's what I mean. Yeah, I'm not sure what else I can say. I'm just taking up too much time now.
no, it's just no worries.
But great,
Just
that's a
sorry
great
for
question, though.
It was just thank you. Anyway, I mean, you say really nice thing. I mean, about the idea that first of all it needs to find a convergence point because otherwise, keep holding. I mean, the two contrary things. I mean, it won't get nowhere.
Just quickly, but isn't this is not a singular case? Isn't this something that happens all the time?
From my point of view, it doesn't happen all the time, but
A
oftentimes.
lot.
Yeah. You know, in terms of dealing with some of my consultees who are dealing with grief, they've come to terms with the death or the loss, and so then we have to deal with it. So that's why I'm saying, Maria, maybe not always, but yeah, I've had a number of.
Well, no, when it has to do with hope saving face in a social. Because I think the mother here feels she has to save face in a sort of more social context.
Yes, yeah.
And so she's making herself believe, because of the social context, because maybe herself, just by herself, she could say, yeah, that was wrong.
Yeah.
But she has the outside pressure to have to, in some sense, lessen it for saving face purposes.
And you know, that could come out in terms of looking at her reasons for her unwillingness to see her son the way he really is. And saving faith along those lines could come, you know, what would other people think about my son?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I like that.
Thank you. And then our last question for Sam is coming from Amy. Amy,
Hi, Amy.
Hi, thanks for the presentation, Sam.
Welcome.
Now, you answered my question a little bit with Maria's first question, that you said that T eventually did admit what he had done. What do you think was the catalyst for that? Like, what was the final kind of straw that made him say, yes, I did it and I have some responsibility here, or I have complete responsibility here? I don't know which one he did.
Okay. Yeah. Now, I think I wore him down.
Fair enough.
I mentioned earlier that I'd had several conversations with him, and I kept bringing the question up. And I think, and when he would come in for these sessions, he was uncomfortable and felt awkward because he knew exactly what I was going to ask him. And so we would talk about his role in this whole thing. And finally, he just, capitulated. He just said, yeah, I did it. And I think it was just a matter of getting him to think about it, coming back, letting him think on his own, and hitting him again.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, and then I think I just wore him out. That's it. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Well, thanks for your questions. I really appreciate it. Your kind attention.
all right, well, thank you, Sam. Moving on. Pretty good on time here, only about 5 minutes over the schedule. Moving on, we have Dr. Bill Knaus. So Dr. Bill Knaus is a former City University of New York professor and adjunct professor at other university systems. While teaching psychology at Queens College, he developed a children's critical thinking and psychological development program. 38 of 38 empirical research studies support the program's efficacy. Bill donated it to the public. As one of the original directors of postdoctoral training at the Albert Ellis Institute, Bill set up training programs and specialty workshops for psychotherapists and trained hundreds. He conducted a wide-ranging private clinical practice. He authored or co-authored 26 books. The most recent are the Cognitive Behavioral Workbook for Anger and the Depression Toolkit. He authored 6 books on procrastination as well. And his original work prompted a self-help movement and research in this area. He's an advocate for people who cannot protect themselves, and he once served as president of a major advocacy group of volunteers. Professor Knaus, whenever you're ready, on how to help clients overcome the triple threat of depression, anxiety, and anger. Bill Knaus, are you there? Yeah.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
We can hear you.
Bill, you're audible now. If you could,
If you
Go
can hear
on
me,
with your-
just give me a thumbs up. Hi, Elliot.
You're on. Speak, Bill.
I can be heard then, right?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. We can hear you, can't see you whenever you're ready.
Well, this is good news. The system sounds like it's working. In any event, today's presentation is going to be on how to help clients overcome the triple threat of depression, anxiety, and anger. And it's sort of interesting that some of the origins for how to go about doing this effectively stems back a few thousand years or more with the Stoics, but I'll get into that later. So let's take a look at what we're up against. Depression, first of all, is not a simple mood condition that is ordinarily uncomplicated, that can be treated in a very simple way. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's a system of problems with multiple complications. And there's various varieties of depression, not all of which respond in quite the same way to the same type of interventions. But when fused with anxiety and with anger, now you have the triple threat. And although anxiety and depression are oftentimes linked together and more or less viewed as a dominant condition, anger is typically an orphan condition, but yet about 50% of the time, if you're depressed, you're also going to be angry. So it's hard to say it's just a condition that has very little relevance. In fact, that's quite a bit. So the three factors, the triple threat, are indeed quite difficult for many people to contend with. They have widespread likely to have widespread problems with the triple threat, both psychologically, socially, and also physiologically. Because if you look at the connection between depression and inflammation, there's a high correlation. Between anxiety and inflammation, there's a high correlation. And with anger and inflammation, there's a high correlation. And whether or not by changing inflammatory bodily conditions, you'll alter those states or not is unknown, but and whether or not changing and becoming less depressed, angry, and anxious will make a difference, that's unclear as well, but there is a connection there. So in any event, let's start with an example. We'll take Tom. Following a unwanted job loss, and for 6 months thereafter, your new client, Tom, is moderately depressed with repetitive dysphoric thoughts like, I can't take this anymore. There's nothing for me in the future but more pain. I might as well end it all. And that's pretty clearly depressive thinking. There's nothing that he thinks can be done. Moreover, he worries that he'll never work again. And because of coronavirus phobia, which a lot of folks nowadays have, and anxiety about dying from the virus, he isolates himself and has very little external contact outside of his immediate family. He claims he doesn't have the energy or will to be with people anymore anyway, so what difference does it really make? He has trouble falling asleep, and people with depression usually do. Interestingly, depression is a condition that more often than not follows anxiety and follows sleep problems, and sleep is simply an accompaniment to that. The same thing might be true of other conditions as well. He wakes up at night after having difficulty falling asleep with, excuse me, vengeful thoughts about his former employer and what other happenstance might have occurred the day before, which didn't go very well for him. He dwells on that during the day as well and broods substantially, and again has rather angry, vengeful thoughts towards people, towards situations. He broods about his past. He dwells on what he could have done or should have done and didn't do, and he really is focused pretty much on his own misfortunes. He feels rage when inconvenienced, and this is something that probably happens to all of us. You get on the phone because you want to get a hold of someone to return say a product, and you're on hold for about 10 or 15 minutes. Tom's reaction is to fume and fuss and build up a head of steam. And then when people do get on the phone, he characteristically yells at them. And that typically doesn't get him very far. Tom daily spends a considerable amount of time watching negative news. And there's plenty of it around, so he doesn't have too much difficulty finding it. And he feels worse, hopeless, and thinks humanity is coming to an end because look at all the bad things that are happening in the world. And he feels helpless to be able to control that. He's gained 15 pounds. He lacks exercise, eats a lot. And when he does try to lose weight, he has sort of like a wheedler in his head that says, hey, we're just going to have one more last feast, and then you're going to be good forever. And of course, he has one last good feast, and then he continues eating, so that doesn't get very far. His wife is not too happy about his situation. She says that he's miserable most of the time, and she doesn't know what she can do. She objects to his relentless criticisms of him and others, but calmly says to herself, this too will pass. She says that phrase helps, but she also says she's coming to the end of her patience, and that her tolerance is not endless. Your client's immediate goals are relief from depression. That's common. To save his marriage, and to do better in managing his temper. And I think he got part of that from his wife on the managing his temper. So the question is, would Tom or might he benefit from a transdiagnostic intervention? So let's look at that. Usually what you find with people who have long-term serious emotional problems are coexisting conditions as well. There are probably exceptions, but if there are, they're very, very, very rare. So when you have the same or similar conditions coexisting, such as depression, anxiety, and anger, with anger as being an orphan topic, but still a salient factor, diagnostic approach might be helpful. And that is where a intervention that applies to one condition, such as depression, may have a positive beneficial effect when used with the other problem-related conditions that accompany depression or accompany anger or accompany anxiety. For example, disrupted sleep accompanies anxiety. You have trouble falling asleep. A lot of people have what are called a pink elephant problem. They try not to think about the pink elephant, or they try not to think about what their anxious thoughts are. And the harder they try to forget what they're thinking about, the more likely they think with greater velocity the thoughts that keep them awake. People with anger very often will wake up sometime during the night with thoughts in their mind about what was bothering them during the day. In Tom's case, it's about his nasty employer who let him go at the worst of all times. The telemarketers who keep calling his house and annoying him, and people who won't answer their phone when he needs help. So he's got endless complaints. And so it's another disruptive factor to his sleep. So if you improve sleep, the question is, would he be less depressed, less angry, less anxious? And the odds are pretty high that he would. So sleep would be a transdiagnostic factor or diagnostic intervention, because what it does is it cuts across multiple conditions where sleep is a factor. As you can imagine, transdiagnostic interventions are of interest to people because they can shorten therapy and deal with multiple issues at the same time. However, how effective they are is still an open question. And part of the reason is that transdiagnostic conditions that might go across depression, anxiety, and anger such as repetitive negative thinking. And the content of that thinking is, of course, different, but the repetitive nature is consistent. If you make a change in that thinking pattern, then there is evidence that in one area, there is evidence that it seems to have a carry-through effect in others. So there are some benefits to the transdiagnostic approach, where you focus one intervention on a particular situation, which is relatively well known to also favorably affect the trajectory of the others in a calming way, and as would be the case with Tom. Other transdiagnostic issues would be internalize and externalize blame. You're not going to find that too much on the literature, and I'll get into why that might be so a little bit later and why that's so critical. But it also seems like a particularly interesting area for philosophical counselors to address, because as a core issue, it's a hidden elephant in the room, and it's a stampeding element because it's present in just about every negative condition you can imagine, where cognitions are major factors. The intensity and duration of all the three conditions, might they be muted by reduction in blame? More likely than not, yes. Okay, by recognizing and challenging self-defeating beliefs, because self-defeating beliefs also cut across the different conditions, your client Tom can make progress, especially if he knows how to address and deal with them effectively. So let's explore 9 transdiagnostic interventions. They're not necessarily going to be the classic ones that you're going to find in the literature, because sometimes what you find in the laboratory and what you focus on in the laboratory are quite different than what you would focus on in the field. The field, the conditions change fairly rapidly. People don't always talk about the same thing. They might come in with a presenting problem of anxiety and then talk the next week about being afraid of a neighbor and being very angry at the same time at the neighbor because the neighbor plays loud music. And that becomes a focal point. But we'll look at some, and the first one is, I think, kind of interesting, and it's relatively easy to do. A lot of people don't really realize that their thinking is interfering with a lot of the ways in which they live their lives, and can have a fairly powerful effect on how they feel. Events do matter. You know, if a railroad train is heading your way and you just are seconds away from getting hit, you're not going to say to yourself, oh, this would be horrible if this would happen. You just would be startled, and automatically so, and then jump out of the way. Sometimes when you have a little more time to think about it, that's where you get yourself into some difficulties. So the first step is to demonstrate in some way that thinking can affect how you feel, and by a change in information from something that's an assumption to something that's a fact can sometimes make a material difference. Now, this sometimes can produce a fair amount of hope among people who think that there isn't anything they can do to change. If they can see that they can change their thinking in one instance, based on new information that's factual and goes against something that they thought was real and true that wasn't that way at all, that might be a good preview experience for them to map a row of possible options laying before them. If you can change your thinking and you can do better, I think a lot of people would be inclined to do that. Now, there are exceptions, of course. If you've been brainwashed into something and have taken a stance and then have disconfirming information, and your group denies that, you might very well go along with it, despite the fact that what you're thinking isn't necessarily clear. But in some instances, when it comes to depression, reducing your negative thinking by seeing its fallacies That in of itself is an action that has favorable consequences, and sometimes repeatedly doing this makes a difference. And in fact, Helen Mayberry, who is in Canada, Mayberg, who's in Canada, who examined people's neural networks after cognitive interventions and practice with developing reasoning skills in opposition to depression, found that the neural networks increased in density that were associated with those interventions. So it became the case that they tended to grow on their own momentum after that. And so did the application of the reasoning, which is kind of interesting when it's not a very well-known study, but I think nevertheless it's an important one. So getting back to changing your thinking, it does have importance. But how do you convince Tom? Well, you can do it by his own complaints and dealing with alternative ways of looking at things. And he might say, yeah, I can see that. But sometimes it's useful to set a foundation to say that sometimes the way in which you can look at things can make a difference. And that is true in depression, and what you believe at one point in time may seem very real and may seem very true, but may not be so under a different light from a different angle, maybe under a magnifying glass or maybe from a telescope. And so here's one technique that I use mainly to train my students, but also to help clients who may have difficulty seeing that the problems that they have in life have nothing to do with them, have nothing to do with how they think, but are all externally based. And if the world would change and people would change, and if these things didn't happen, then they would be well and right, and the world would be cool and everything would go well. And this simple exercise sometimes helps dissuade them from it. So this is intervention number one, which is, yeah, let's take a look at and see if there's another perspective that is possible. So let's suppose you're going for an important job interview. And this is something you really were terribly interested in for quite a while, and this is your opportunity. And it's a bright, sunny spring day, and you're chipping along the sidewalk, feeling fairly good because you're well prepared and you have a good feeling about how this is going to work out. All of a sudden, a vehicle swerves, and this is unfortunately after a rainstorm, and there's a puddle nearby, and the vehicle hits the puddle, and you're drenched from head to toe. And there you are, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, drenched. You're not too far away from where the interview is going to take place. And the question is, how would you feel? Now, I've done this hundreds of times with people, and it ranges from murderous rage, and I wish I had a shotgun, and where's that tank, to utter fear of what people are going to think of when I go in for the interview. I'm going to be drenched. I can't do it. I'm going to be so embarrassed. And so you have a wide range of different emotive reactions to the same event. Everybody, you've been wet and you've been sopped. Well, why would different people respond in different ways? And very often the group or the individual will say, well, you know, people can read it, the same situation differently. So that introduces the idea that how you think can make a difference. Now, let's introduce just one small little detail. Let's suppose you're one of those individuals who is both depressed at the same time at the thought that you're never going to get the job you want, and ruination is at your doorstep, because without that, life isn't worth living, which is sort of extreme, but I've also heard that. Close to rage of if you could run fast enough and get that driver would be in serious trouble. But let's suppose that as you look out into the road, what you see is a toddler and a crying mother, and suddenly you realize that the driver swerved to miss the child. Would you feel the same way? Now, some people would still be angry, but not quite in the same way or with the same degree of intensity, and blame the mother. shouldn't let the child out. You should watch the child. Some would feel so greatly relieved that getting a job interview, and whether it works out or whether it doesn't, is hardly worth the death of a child. So the driver was certainly certainly was good that the driver swerved. Whatever inconvenience you have is nothing like that. So if the client sees that new information can make a difference, and especially if depressed, agrees with that, then why wouldn't there be cause for hope if the depression thoughts that your client had were somewhat of a hoax? So I think that's the first intervention is what it is, because it sets the stage. And clients who accept natural emotional responses to evocative situations are likely those who are more likely the ones who no longer have negative thoughts or jump to conclusions, but sit back and reflect under conditions where that makes perfectly good sense to do. So it's a transdiagnostic intervention to lay the foundation for making the connection between thoughts and feelings and actions. And sometimes it's very useful, and if the client already has an understanding of that, then you wouldn't necessarily do it. But I think it's useful in particular with those who tend to be more externalizing or internally blaming and criticizing, to see that what you do in the future, you can connect to this as though this were a ideological scaffolding or coat hook to hang an idea onto that can be used again and again. The second intervention is to identify the distinctive, repetitive, negative thoughts, or what I call cognitive signatures, that go with each condition. They might be repetitive, but the content generally tends to be different. There's a couple of reasons for doing that. One is if you can identify a string of thoughts that are common to depression and the person agrees with them, an obvious question might be, where do you think those ideas came from? And they say, well, maybe from me. Well, yeah, you and thousands of others, millions of others across time, space, continents, and cultures. There's a certain continuity of thought that tends to be consistent with depression. Now, a depressed cat isn't going to be sitting around thinking, I'm a bad cat, I can't catch mice. The cat will likely just sit and watch as the mouse goes by, and might make a half-hearted effort, but isn't really into it. But they're not necessarily blaming themselves, criticizing themselves, blaming the world, thinking life is hopeless, and doing all the various things that humans have a remarkable tendency to do. So when you think hopeless thoughts, it's a discretionary thought. It isn't necessarily that it's so. The other part is anxiety. So what happens when you feel anxious? To some extent or another, you're looking into the future. There's an upcoming event, it might be uncertain or might be more sure, who knows. But you're looking at yourself as not being able to cope or cope effectively enough. And that is sort of an overlap with depression. You have hopelessness and depression, helplessness and depression, powerlessness, powerless to do anything, powerless to act, passive recipient of someone, of things to come, and what you can do is retreat. There isn't much else if you're really bound into a pretty high level of anxiety. That's one of the things that you might do. So that's a cognitive signature of that, but you normally would want to evoke from a client pretty much what they're thinking, so it's in their own words. But that's a construct or concept that you can have, because if someone's anxious, if they think they're powerful and they can handle the situation, that doesn't sound like anxiety to me. A third would be anger. So what are the cognitive signatures of anger? Well, of course, there's a variety of different angers. This is a very complicated area. most people, or I mean, not most, many think that anger is a bad thing, and we should get rid of it, and so on and so forth. The emotion of anger goes way back a couple 100,000 years or more, and probably before that. And what it was is a signal to the tribe that there was an intruding tribe or there was a predator. And hey, gang, there's enough of us, we can handle it. So an arousal of anger then would be a move forward against an adversary, and it has a functional value there. Fear would have its own tone, and that had functionality too, because it would say, look, there's just going to be too much for us, and the group would move away, or the individual would. So in the beginning, the origins of emotions had clear functionality. When we started adding cognitive features to it, the world begins to alter and change within ourselves, and our emotions are somewhat governed by what we think, more so than by the responses, primary responses we had to events a couple 100,000 years ago. The beliefs we have today, of course, range from fictions to facts, and it's wise to know the difference. So what if you learn that the person that you thought had snubbed you by passing you in the hall without greeting you had just learned that they had cancer? That might put things in a different perspective. As with the splashing incident, it's the same. You notice something, how you interpret, define, evaluate, judge can make a difference. So methods to decrease depression, anxiety, and anger thinking are transdiagnostic interventions. Changing wrong beliefs is one of the methods. And you be able to change the wrong belief. It's normally better to identify what it is. Again, as I mentioned, with the client's own words. Third intervention. The ancient Stoic philosophers saw emotions as following judgments, and they worked to correct wrong thinking, to experience emotions and render judgments free of such distortions. Now, there's a lot of ways in which the past can be read, and Margaret Graver from Dartmouth, that's her view. And it's not all that different from Albert Ellis's and others. It's just an alteration in the wording. According to her research, they wanted to get rid of as much wrong thinking as they can to experience pure emotions, so that their actions would be congruent with reasonable and rational judgments. And that's one aspect of it, and it's a reasonably useful way of looking at things. So we got a kind of a cognitive framework way back when, and interestingly, there's also a behavioral framework. Seneca's advice, behavioral advice, was to set aside a certain number of days during time, using that time to build resilience for a later time. His advice is say, is this condition that I feel, is this the condition that I feel, the condition of hardship that you put yourself in? If you put yourself in the scantiest and cheapest fare with coarse and rough ideas, and if you could see that this is not so bad and that you can tolerate it, then that's a good direction towards resilience training, which is a big thing to do nowadays. So you have a kind of a cognitive aspect and a behavioral homework aspect. Set aside some time to build resilience to hardship, so that if real hardship comes, you're prepared for it. So I think the early Stoics were among the first cognitive behavioral therapists. They dealt with changing thinking through practice and psychological type homework assignments in the form of resilience training and probably other things as well. Their work later appeared in Robert Burton's 1621 Anatomy of Emotions, which is a fairly substantial piece of work. He had sort of mixed responses to the Stoics, and I don't necessarily, from his reading his work, think that he put it to good use, but he did set it out as possible self-help possibilities for those who read his book. In 1909, Paul Dubois, who wrote a book, the focus of which was on rational therapy. So he was one of the first rational therapists probably of the 20th century. And he applied Stoic principles to help people think clearly on the idea that by thinking clearly, you're going to rid yourself of a lot of emotional distresses, because he saw clearly himself that thoughts and feelings tended to be interlaced, and the clearer your thinking is, the more relevant your feelings are likely to be to the situation that's at hand. And like Seneca, he also assigned homework assignments, which people would then take and test out during the course of the week. So I don't know whether he was the first to do that, and I doubt it, but he certainly emphasized it. And that was a major part of his rational therapy. Now, the cognitive behavioral approach is a premier approach at this point in time, and for resources for transdiagnostic interventions. There's quite a few of them. It's kind of interesting that the origins go back as far as they do. And the other question is, how effective is rationally emotive therapy, which is more clearly linked to the Stoic views. Cognitive therapy, which is somewhat of an extension of that and independent of rational emotive therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy, which is sort of a consolidation of those views and many others. How effective is it? Did the Stoics know what they were doing? Were they all wet? Did we have to really refine what they did in such a way that it's unrecognizable as to what took place a few thousand years ago? I don't know. It seems to me like when you don't have any really viable ways of helping yourself deal with emotional distresses, and you hit upon a solution of ridding yourself of wrong thinking, and then you set about trying to find out what that wrong thinking is and then correcting it, and then you're able to tolerate distress and view things in a different light and have more flexibility, that would seem like that's a very good beginning. How about the empirical basis for that phase of cognitive therapy, rational emotive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy? Is there any empirical evidence that it takes those factors into account? And the answer is sure. How many? Well, a few years ago when I was writing the cognitive behavioral workbook for anger, I was curious, how many meta-analyses are there on cognitive behavioral therapy? So what I did is I did the exercise of going through the literature, and I found 500 and something. And I later found other people who had written about the numbers of meta-analysis, so I probably would have saved myself a lot of trouble if I learned about that first, but I did. And the preponderance of the evidence is very clearly in the camp of cognitive behavioral therapy, and others who have done similar counts have come up with probably a few more than I was able to find. So what that does is it tends to have some encouraging information about changing thinking, since that's a fairly significant part of cognitive behavioral therapy. Otherwise, why call it cognitive? The ancient Stoics might have been pleased to discover that cognitive behavioral therapy, given its enormous research support, is gold standard. No one has come close to that type of support, and it goes across a wide range of different conditions, from agoraphobia to probably zoophobia. A lot of the concentration is in the area of depression, anxiety, anger, and other conditions that are sort of like that, phobias.
Hey, Bill,